Ask any foreign government negotiating with Washington right now the same question, and you'll get some version of the same uneasy answer. What does the president's word actually guarantee anymore? Because over the past year and a half, the United States has bombed Iranian nuclear sites and declared the program totally and completely obliterated, only for the same president to say, within months, that Iran was on the verge of building multiple nuclear weapons. That single contradiction, stated by the same man about the same program, is at the center of an argument now being made across foreign policy circles spanning the political spectrum, from progressive commentators to conservative columnists, that Donald Trump's approach to Iran isn't just failing to produce results, it's actively burning down something far harder to rebuild than a nuclear facility: American credibility itself. Let's start with what that word, credibility, actually means in international relations, because it's easy to treat it as a vague talking point rather than something concrete. Domestically, if someone breaks a contract, you can go to court and the government enforces the outcome. That mechanism is what makes contracts trustworthy in the first place, and it's what makes people willing to sign them. Internationally, no such court exists. All any nation has to go on is another nation's word, its physical capabilities, and its pattern of past behavior. When that pattern becomes unpredictable, when promises made one month get reversed the next, other governments stop being able to calculate what any given commitment is actually worth. And according to a growing chorus of analysts, that's exactly what's happened with Trump's handling of Iran. The pattern itself is what critics keep coming back to. At various points throughout this conflict, Trump has publicly called for regime change in Iran, then for unconditional surrender, then for a total end to Iran's nuclear program, then for curtailing its missile program, then for changing Iran's posture toward Israel entirely. Each of these has been floated as the actual goal at different moments, without ever settling into one consistent, stated objective. From Tehran's perspective, that inconsistency creates an impossible negotiating position. Even if Iranian leadership were genuinely open to making real concessions, they have no reliable way of knowing which concession would actually satisfy Washington. Because the ask itself keeps shifting. One widely circulated opinion piece put it plainly: Trump has neither made clear demands of the Iranian government, nor offered any face-saving off-ramp that would let Tehran exit the conflict without looking like it capitulated. Without either of those things, the argument goes, you don't have a negotiation. You have a stalemate dressed up as diplomacy. This isn't a new pattern specific to this war either, and critics are quick to point to the deeper history behind it. Trump's decision to pull the United States out of the 2015 nuclear agreement with Iran, the JCPOA, is repeatedly cited as the original credibility wound because Iran was, according to international inspectors at the time, actually complying with the terms of that deal when Washington withdrew from it anyway. If a country upholds its end of an agreement and the other side walks away regardless, that teaches every other government watching a very specific lesson. American commitments are conditional, revocable, and dependent on domestic politics rather than durable international law. That lesson, critics argue, has directly shaped how Iran, and frankly, how much of the rest of the world, now approaches any deal Washington puts forward. Then there's the specific whiplash around the strikes themselves. After the United States bombed Iranian nuclear sites, Trump declared the program totally and completely obliterated, language meant to project decisive, overwhelming success. But within roughly a year, he was telling the public Iran was on the verge of possessing multiple nuclear weapons, an assessment that directly contradicts the earlier claim of total destruction. One of two things is true here, and neither one is particularly reassuring. Either the original strikes didn't actually achieve what was claimed, or the newer warning is itself exaggerated for political effect. Either way. Critics argue the American public and foreign governments are left with no reliable signal for how to interpret official statements about this war going forward. There's also a financial and strategic dimension to this argument that goes well beyond rhetoric. One widely discussed analysis framed this war as a geoeconomic own goal, arguing that the conflict has exposed critical weaknesses in American military and diplomatic positioning, eroded soft power, alienated longtime allies, and even elevated China's relative standing in the region. That analysis pointed out something genuinely striking. Despite fighting a country whose military budget is roughly 1/100th the size of the Pentagon's, and whose economy has been devastated by years of sanctions, the world's most powerful military has still failed to force a clean, decisive resolution. Iran, battered as it is, may actually emerge from this war with more leverage than it had going in, having gained what one analysis called asymmetric power over the global economy simply through its ability to threaten vital choke points like the Strait of Hormuz whenever it chooses. European reaction has followed a similar thread. Commentary examining the transatlantic relationship throughout this conflict has argued that Trump's approach didn't just fail to break Iran, it deepened Tehran's reliance on China widened an already growing rift between Washington and its European partners, and made American power look, in that analysis's own words, erratic rather than commanding. That's a particularly pointed criticism, because credibility on the world stage has always rested heavily on predictability, allies and adversaries alike being able to reasonably forecast how the United States will behave in a given scenario. When that predictability disappears, alliances built over decades start to fray, not through any single dramatic rupture, but through a slow accumulation of uncertainty. Perhaps the sharpest version of this argument compares the current moment to one of the most cited cautionary tales in recent American foreign policy: the Obama administration's Syria red line, the 2013 warning that using chemical weapons would trigger direct American intervention, a threat that, when actually tested, did not result in the promised military response. That episode became, for an entire generation of foreign policy analysts, the textbook example of a credibility failure, a public commitment made and then not followed through on. Commentary examining Trump's Iran policy has drawn a direct line between that moment and this one, arguing that a presidency built partly on bluff, improvisation, and dramatic public declarations is now running into the exact same wall Obama did, discovering that threats only carry weight if adversaries actually believe they'll be carried out. Now, it's worth being clear that this argument, however widely echoed across ideologically diverse outlets, is not universally accepted, and there is a genuine countercase worth hearing. Some commentators have argued the opposite entirely, that jeopardizing prior agreements and taking a harder, less predictable posture is actually what restores credibility, rather than what erodes it, framing previous, more cautious approaches to Iran as a kind of appeasement that needed correcting. Others point out that the American public has historically supported even unpopular, costly military engagements, provided those engagements are ultimately seen as successful, and argue it's simply too early in this conflict to render a final verdict on whether Trump's approach will, in the end, produce exactly the kind of decisive outcome that silences these credibility concerns entirely. From this perspective, volatility and unpredictability aren't necessarily weaknesses. They can function as their own form of leverage, keeping adversaries off balance and unable to plan confidently around a known, fixed American posture. Where that leaves us is a genuinely open question, and one that will likely only be answered by how this war actually concludes, not by how it's currently being narrated on any side. If Iran is ultimately forced into a durable, verifiable agreement that meaningfully limits its nuclear and missile programs, the shifting demands and aggressive unpredictability that critics point to right now may end up remembered as unconventional but ultimately effective pressure tactics. But if this war ends the way a growing number of analysts currently fear, with Iran battered but defiant, with regional rivals like Saudi Arabia dragged deeper into a fight they spent months trying to avoid, with allies in Europe and beyond, increasingly uncertain about what an American commitment is actually worth. And then the argument being made across so many different ideological corners of the commentary world right now that this conflict has cost the United States something far more durable than any single battlefield outcome may prove to be exactly right. Either way, the world is watching how this ends just as closely as it's watching how it's being fought. Because in international politics, being unpredictable and being untrustworthy can look remarkably similar from the outside, right up until the moment someone actually needs to rely on your word.